Jen, are we all set with the? Yep. Okay. So first of all, my name is Irene Etkin-Goldman. I'm the board chair of the Coalition for Peace Action, also known as CFPA. So during our remarks, if we're referring to CFPA, you know about whom we're speaking. So greet you all, thank you for coming, especially to our honored guests and to our members and new visitors and to our friends who are visiting us virtually. And thankfully, we learned all of this technology. The sad part of COVID is the sad part about COVID, and the good news is that we've become technologically nimble. So I want to mention we have a wonderful and long-standing board steering committee at the Coalition for Peace Action, but we have three new members this year, and I'd just like to lift up their names. Erica DeCranes, Manisha Patel, who is here, and Reverend Bill Neely from UU congregation here in Princeton. And Manisha traveled all the way from Pennsylvania, where we also have a terrific chapter going as well. So thank you for joining us. It's a special honor today to honor Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman. And on behalf of the Coalition for Peace Action, CFPA, we are delighted to be honoring Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman for her outstanding peace leadership over many years. Representative Watson Coleman is ever true to her personal ethos for a world at peace, so in line with the ideals of the Coalition for Peace Action. Before being elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 2014, while serving as New Jersey State Assemblywoman, she wholly supported the Coalition's Ceasefire New Jersey project for strong gun violence prevention measures. And she's spoken at CFPA rallies against the Iraq War, among the many activities that we have taken together. Shortly after announcing her candidacy for Congress in 2014, Representative Watson Coleman accepted CFPA's offer for a candidate briefing on our issues. Some were new to her. She showed an eagerness to become informed, and that's how she is in life. She's eager to learn what's new and to take it seriously and study the issues. And for 90 minutes, she was deeply engaged with our experts, such as Professor Frank von Hippel, who is here today in our audience, right here. Thank you, Frank. Ambassador Hossein Mousavian, a former spokesperson for Iran's nuclear negotiation team, and with our organizational leaders. She was prepared then in 2015 when the Iran nuclear agreement came before Congress before it could enter into force. Representative Watson Coleman was lobbied heavily by opponents of the agreement, but stood firm in support of it. As a result, Iran was verifiably kept at least a year away from getting enough nuclear weapon material for even one bomb. That was then. Representative Watson Coleman's peace leadership continues with an overwhelmingly positive voting record in support of sustained diplomacy, with an overwhelmingly positive voting record on peace votes. Perfect, in my opinion, in our opinion. Earlier this year, she co-signed a congressional letter in support of sustained diplomacy to permanently end the Yemen war, in sync with our own campaign for diplomacy, not war. She co-sponsored two vital bills with CFPA strongly supported: a resolution in support of the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and steps towards that end, and the People Over the Pentagon Act, which would reduce military spending by about 10% to counter recent dramatic increases in that budget. Representative Watson Coleman has been a true champion for peace. She has always held her door open to receive our periodic CFPA delegations, to hear our concerns and recommendations. We are most honored and pleased to present her with this award. Bob, would you please come up, and we would like to present an award to Bonnie Watson Coleman, and if, Bonnie, would you mind if we stood in front of the podium for a minute and took a picture with you in the middle? My dear friend as well.
And before we ask Representative Watson Coleman, I think wants to say a few things in reply, I just had one PS to what Irene said, which is, this is one time I wish we could clone a human being, namely her. Because if we had people like her in this Congress, we would have peace in this world.
Bonnie is a dear friend, and thank you for saying some few words for
Thank
her.
you, thank you. Thanks, Irene. I mean, I can always depend upon Irene to encourage me, to remind me also. And I'm always delighted to be here with you, Reverend Moore, and you, my teacher. Irene is right. I'm always eager to learn. I didn't profess to know, still don't, but I am very much eager to learn. I am a proponent of peace, be it in my street, my neighborhood, my community, my country, or the world. And we just have so much work to do now that we cannot get disappointed, we cannot remain silent, we cannot be defeated. Peace will win out if we are consistently its advocate. You know, for decades, we saw peace as the norm. We saw the United States standing strongly as an example of how it is to live and govern and be respectful of diversity and inclusion on all those things, and to show the world what respect for human rights looks like. Unfortunately, the last couple of years or so have tainted that. But fear not, I think we have a president that respects our rights as human beings, our diversity, and peaceful pursuit. And I just want to make sure that he remains in that position to take us into the next phase of our life here. Years ago, when you all were young, a very good friend of mine became a part of Jerry.
Stop. No.
Yuri. You know, I've been saying his name all day long because I don't want to forget it, but I remember Jerry talking to us about the coalition. Wasn't particularly paying attention, but I appreciated him, and I figured anything he belonged to was worthy of considering. And then, so when I got my chance to get to be briefed by you all and to be engaged with you all, I recognized why that was such a precious moment for him. That was a good man who had a tragic ending, but I know where he is right now, Reverend. Let me just say that our challenges are many right now. If we look at what's happened in the United States of America, we know that the rights of the LGBTQ, the Muslim, the Jew, the Black, the Hispanic, the poor, the needy, the disabled, and even in some regards the veterans are being challenged. And we don't stand for that. That's un-American. That's as un-American as it is banning books. But then we look to the rest of the world and we see that there is strife and war and abuse and just terrifying regimes across this world. But we must be in a position to speak out and be helpful. From Ukraine to Yemen to the Sudan to everywhere, to Central Africa, everywhere, wherever we see peace and prosperity of people being just disrespected, disregarded, and the result of a demonized governance over them, we must speak up. And so I look out here, and I am just so delighted, I'm pleased, I'm blessed to be a part of you. I'm always here for you to share with me your concerns, your feelings. I'll appreciate the pat on the back when I do something right, but I also will appreciate the admonition when I didn't get something right. So thank you for supporting me. Thank you for doing the work that you do. I don't know the senators here. Senator Zwicker was here for a moment.
Yes.
Yeah. But I tell you, he and I became friends when we were running against one another. That's a good man. That's a good man, and we're lucky to have him. Thank you. Continue your work. God bless you. And I am so sorry I'm not going to be here to hear your presentation. Thank you. God bless. Thank you, Stephen. God bless you.
Trita, come on. Bob. One more.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bonnie Watson Coleman. Woo! Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm going to frame this.
Excellent.
I don't have the PC, you'll see it on the wall.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to ask Bob Moore to come up and make the official introduction for our dear friend Trita Parsi, who speaks to us on global issues in such an intelligent and informative way. We learn so much from you, Trita, and so I'm passing this along to Bob. Pardon me?
We have my talk and the fundraising pitch first.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's, in the schedule, Bob will come up and, well, you'll continue with the program. I'm gonna sit next to Trita.
Thank you, Irene, and we were pleased to have Representative Watson Coleman here to be honored by us, an honor that's deeply and well-deserved. And unfortunately, her schedule was very tight today, and so this was the way we could work that in. So we appreciate very much the beginning of our program today. I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes now about some of the overview of some of our recent accomplishments, but also what are the challenges ahead for us. And then Reverend Carol Haig, I guess this is in your printed program, will be giving you a short invitation to make a gift after that. And then I will introduce Dr. Parsi at that point. I'd like to begin by thanking each and every one of you, whether you're in person or whether you're attending on Zoom, for your participation in and support of the Coalition for Peace Action. Because if there's one thing that I've learned over my just about 45 years now of full-time peacemaking, one thing that I've learned is that peace is a team effort. Can you say that with me? Peace is a team effort. And wow, what a team you all have been. Nobody does this alone. There's no such thing as a lone ranger. It's when we partner together, when we work together, when we encourage each other, when we inspire each other, that's when things get done. And so I'd like you to just take a look. For those of you in person, you can look in your program at the green sheet, the highlights of our accomplishments over the past year. If you're on Zoom, you can see a link for that posted in the chat box. And I'd like you to just take a look at that, and I want to underline a few things before I look at some of the challenges ahead of us. Most of the things on that list are events that we've done over the past year. But the second bullet I wanted to dwell on for just a minute, which is our gun violence prevention work through our Ceasefire New Jersey campaign. And by the way, our legislative director for that campaign, Dolores Phillips, is here with us. Dolores, stand up for a minute so we can, Dolores is doing a great job. And look at some of the accomplishments that we've had. Just last year, just in 2022, 8 new pieces of gun safety legislation were passed and signed into law. 8. Since 2018, 22 new gun safety regulations. Why is that important? Because statistics show New Jersey, for example, has the second strongest gun safety laws in the country, according to the Giffords Law Center, and we have the fourth lowest rate of gun violence per capita. Those things go together. These things matter. Now, the last point there about the bill signed by Governor Murphy on December 22nd, just a few days before Christmas, was to push back on the concealed carry expansion that happened after the so-called Bruin decision, which said that, the Second Amendment says you ought to, basically almost everybody ought to be able to carry a concealed weapon. New Jersey before that had such stringent laws that most of the people who had those permits were former police officers. There was only 500 or 600 permits per year. At this point, since the Bruin decision, there's over 6,500 permits that have been issued for that, and only 100 have been declined. Well, a U.S. district judge, we were able to include in that sensitive spaces that you could not carry a concealed gun in, even if you had the license. I just want to mention 3 of those. You couldn't carry a gun under this law into a bar, into a library, or into a park. Those are all places that we want to feel safe, right? Well, this district judge said, no, that's illegal. That's against the Second Amendment. And so that is suspended right now, the implementation of that law. I mean, think about this just logically. What could go wrong in a bar if somebody's drinking too much? What could possibly go wrong? Well, if there's no guns there, somebody might get beaten up or slugged or something, but they're probably going to survive. They're probably going to stay alive. If there's guns allowed in that bar, just think of what you have. The Wild West, and that's what I think a lot of these pro-gun people have in mind. They want it to be the Wild West. The good news is it immediately got appealed to the appeals court, and there's a very good chance that that's going to be overruled at that level. We also work hard, though, besides that, and I'm going to mention some more about gun violence when I get to the upcoming challenges part, but we also work hard on some other things that aren't on that list that you see. For example, our media work. This past year, we had 45 articles published in media throughout not only New Jersey, but throughout the nation. 45, nearly 1 per week. We had our Peace Voter campaign, as mentioned in there, and the 5th bullet. And we are pioneers for a Peace Voter campaign that maximizes our influence in a nonpartisan way of peace on the electoral debate. And we were the pioneers in that going all the way back to 1994. We did the very first Peace Voter campaign in this country. Absolutely, thank you. And we are the first Peace Action affiliate to have a No Wars, No Warming campaign, and Ed Aguilar helped spearhead that. Ed's the head of our Philadelphia office. It's a team effort. And we're the only one to have a diplomacy, not war campaign. So we are spearheading, we are pioneering new ways of doing intersectional work that is a way that we can get more clout and have more influence. We thank you for your support for all of that. Let me just mention one last thing, and that is our work on peace legislation. We work on that all year round. And some of it is quiet behind the scenes. Some of it is very accessible to you, by the way, because we'll send out a link. We'll send out a message saying, click here and email your elected representatives. It only takes you 1 minute most of the time. Well, I want to tell you something, because sometimes you may say, does that really make a difference? Irene mentioned the Iran nuclear agreement. You know who a swing vote on that was right up to the last minute? Senator Cory Booker. And I called one of his top aides before that vote. And I said, what is it? What's making a difference in his thinking? And you know what she said? She said, we're getting so many emails saying he needs to support this. That's because you folks did what we asked you to and sent your emails. So keep doing it. Keep doing it. Now, the challenges ahead. These are daunting challenges. I already mentioned the Bruin decision was a major setback of allowing more concealed carry of guns. It's a recipe for a Wild West everywhere. And we need to pass more new gun safety laws, though. So even though we passed 8 last year, there was one we couldn't quite get over the finish line. It was for secure storage of guns, safe storage of guns in your home. Now, the Supreme Court ruled some years ago that you're entitled to have a gun in your home for self-defense. So that's not being contested. But if you choose to have one, it needs to be stored securely. Because if it isn't, what happens is a child finds it and starts shooting it at themselves or others. Or a teenager in the house whose girlfriend just broke up with him feels suicidal. If they can access that gun, there's a strong chance that if they attempt suicide, that it's going to result in death. In fact, over 90% of suicide attempts that are done by a gun, over 90% result in death. If it's by any means other than a gun, only 2 or 3% succeed. If I can use that word. Only 2 or 3% result in death. Huge difference on whether there's access to a gun. So this work is important, and we are going to be working on that bill to get it through, hopefully later this year. Gun violence in this whole country is now the leading cause of death for children and teens. That is shameful. Children are our most precious thing in this life. And if we're allowing them to be killed, it used to be automobile accidents. That has been surpassed. This is shameful. We need to reverse this. There's over 250 mass shootings this year, nearly 2 per day. This is unconscionable, and we are working to bring a stop to it. Now, Pentagon spending and our peace economy priority. Let me just mention a few things about that. Pentagon spending is now nearly $900 billion a year. Last year, the Congress increased it by more than President Biden requested, about $40 or $50 billion, more than he even requested. And that crowds out other categories of discretionary spending. For example, if we weren't spending so much money on the Pentagon, we could have easily continued to pay for the tax benefits that we were starting to give for children, parents of young children. So they were getting money to help support those children, to send them to nursery school, to pay for their food, their clothing, the necessities of life. That was stopped. That was a pandemic thing, and it cut poverty in half. It cut child poverty in half. We need to spend money on saving our children from poverty and not on building up more and more weaponry. And if you want to talk about government waste, some of you may have seen the 60 Minutes segment, just the Sunday night before last. Do you know what the markup that they charge, apart from regular commercial vendors, is between 40% and 4,000%. 4,000% markup by the Pentagon for things that somebody else could get for 1/400th of that amount. So we need to ramp up our work on this, and as Irene said, Representative Watson Coleman is a co-sponsor of the People Over the Pentagon Act. Now finally, on our founding goal of the global abolition of nuclear weapons, which we've had a lot of huge steps backwards in recent years and even the last decade. The last nuclear arms control agreement we had was the New START agreement in 2010, 13 years ago. And even that is in danger of going under now. All of the other agreements have been withdrawn from, going back to George W. Bush, who withdrew from the ABM Treaty, and of course the most recent withdrawals were by President Trump, who withdrew from the Iran nuclear agreement and the Open Skies agreement, lots of good things that he withdrew from. And I mentioned the New START agreement. Russia and the U.S. have both announced that they're no longer going to abide by the inspections regime that is part of that. This is critical, Because if we don't know what adversaries are about trying to do to each other, if we don't know what the numbers are and what the readiness is, then nuclear war can start by accident. It's a very dangerous situation. So we have been part of, and this is a glimmer of hope, I don't want to leave you on a downbeat note here. There is a national campaign called Back from the Brink that we are part of, along with a lot of faith groups and a lot of other progressive groups, Union of Concerned Scientists, and so on. And we have a resolution, House Resolution 77, that is in support of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and steps toward that end. This was the UN's treaty in 2017. And that needed co-sponsors for that resolution because they were just not getting much traction. And we approached 3 members of Congress so far in our region. One of them was just here, Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman. But also Representative Andy Kim and Representative Frank Pallone, when we asked them and met with them, they all said, yes, we will co-sponsor. And that's the kind of results that we're about getting. So we need your support to sustain and intensify our organizing. Shortly, you're going to hear from Reverend Carol Haig about financially supporting our work, and I hope you'll be as generous as possible. If you didn't bring a pen, we're going to be circulating with pens in a moment. Yes, Sophia's back there. Raise your hand even now if you need a pen to be able to write on the envelope in your packet, and she'll be happy to bring you one. The membership envelope, be sure to take a look at that. Pull it out of your, let me pull mine out so you can see what I'm talking about, this blue one, okay? If you're online, there'll be a link that you can use for doing this, and you can make your donation by check, by credit card, or by cash if you're here. Obviously, by credit card if you're online. Now, at the bottom of that membership envelope, don't overlook what's there, because that's ways that you can volunteer your time to be on one of our committees, to be an office volunteer. We need you to be part of the team. So we are also interested in your active involvement. And finally, remember that, one other thing on that, recruiting the membership donations. Another way you can help us be stronger is to ask your friends, your contacts, your colleagues at work, your neighbors. Invite them to join the Coalition for Peace Action. All right, this is called peer-to-peer outreach, and it works. We've got a former fighter pilot. Unfortunately, he was going to be here today, but I recognized him. He had an injury over the weekend. Richard Moody is his name. He's recruited over 8 new members for us by reaching out to the people he knows. Some of them are veterans, like he is. Some of them are members of the Religious Society of Friends. People will do things if they're asked to. There's no guarantee, but by you asking, you amplify the number of our members, which means not only do we have more financial resources, it means we have more political clout. So please consider doing that as well. And finally, when you get those e-alerts, as I said earlier, please take a moment. It only takes 1 minute. Send your emails, because I can tell you for sure they make a difference. And now I'd like to ask Reverend Carol Haig to come on up.
Well, Bob has told you how. I'd like to share some ideas of why. And greetings to those who are not with us, or I don't know how you look at the people who are on the screen, but our virtual friends, hello. Hi. 43 years ago, the Coalition for Nuclear Disarmament, which was its name then, was founded and helped swell a huge nuclear weapons-free demonstration in New York City. Over 1,000 people got on the train in Princeton to join that, and it became over 1 million representatives asking for a nuclear freeze, the largest demonstration in US history. There was a flood of concern at that time about the dangers of nuclear weapons. The perceived immediacy of that danger has faded in recent years, replaced in the general consciousness by climate change and other very real concerns. The threat by hundreds of nuclear weapons on hair-trigger alert across the globe hardly even makes the news anymore. And upgrading our U.S. nuclear weapons is presented as good housekeeping. Partly because nuclear weapons have not been employed, the reality of their threat is hidden from view. We, gathered here in person, online, have a huge responsibility. We are the Coalition for Peace Action. And this Coalition for Peace Action is one organization, not the only, but one huge organization committed to preventing instant annihilation on the planet Earth by nuclear weapons. We are responsible for its health and vitality. We must, and we can, raise awareness of this clear and present danger. We must, and we can, keep the message of the coalition alive and well. We must, and we can, support the work that will save our planet. As Bonnie Watson Coleman said earlier, we need not be discouraged. She also said, we start with peace at home. We start with peace in our neighborhood. We start with peace in our country. No wonder we are working to create more peace and less weapons in this state where we live. It is the basis of this much larger, more huge danger that we face. And because the coalition's role is so important, 3 friends have combined to offer $4,000 as a challenge match if the rest of us here in person and online, and some who responded even beforehand, if we can match that challenge, we will add $4,000 to the coalition's work of spreading the word, of including people, of getting the message out, of making it something that is newsworthy and not so-ho, we don't care. The coalition is an equal opportunity receiver. They will receive pennies or bills or credit cards or checks or promissory notes. They are all cheerfully accepted. And so, as Bob stated, there is a donation envelope in your program, and he showed you, and I've got one too. These have been going on for years. They must have had a really good deal. It must have printed thousands of them a long time ago. So if you were planning on making a contribution today, I invite you to do so. I also invite you to think again and see if you could increase that a little bit. Everybody who is here is a member of the coalition, and we are probably all donors to the coalition. And so I'm asking you to dig deeper. Carl and I give to the coalition every quarter, and here is our check for an extra $100. If 40 people are willing and able to add $100 to what they were going to do or have done, we would make that $4,000. If some can do more, some can do less. But I invite us to think about how this small group can be as powerful as the 1,000 who marched on the train to New York 40 years ago. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being wise to the dangers of nuclear weapons. And thank you for every way you contribute. Thank you. I'm going to collect checks in this basket afterwards.
So on your way out, please look for that basket. If you don't see the basket, I actually was going to introduce a few of our other key people who are here anyway on the team, and you can just give it to them. Oh, Carol's passing around you now. If any of you are ready to write yours out, this is great. And by the way, I don't know if any of you remember the 11th commandment. Probably a lot of you don't. Wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, thou shalt pass the plate. We got to obey that commandment. So other members of the team, if you can't find the basket, you can also bring it to our executive assistant, Jen New. Jen, thank you so much. You're doing a great job as our executive assistant. Yeah, and pens. We need some more pens, Sophia. Pens. And more, good. And Sophia is our summer intern, Sophia DeCruz. Let's give her a hand. And finally, a special word of thanks to Steve Rowley, who's our tech person today. Without him, doing this as a hybrid event would have been utterly impossible. And so, all right, and it's now my honor to introduce our keynote speaker for today, and it truly is an honor. Dr. Trita Parsi is currently Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute. Previously, he was co-founder and director of the National Iranian American Council. We work closely with him in support of the Iran nuclear agreement, and he has spoken for CFPA multiple times in the last 15 years. As you hear him today, I'm sure you'll agree. He is a dynamic and deeply informed speaker and a writer on a host of peace and international relations issues. An excellent example is his recent New York Times op-ed, "The United States is not an indispensable peacemaker." And so he's one of the leading lights, in my judgment, for the peace and justice movement across America. It's my honor to invite Dr. Trita Parsi to address us.
Thank you so much, Bob. It's such a tremendous honor and pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm truly humbled hearing about the amazing work that the Coalition has been doing for such a long time. And I want to give my particular thanks to the Coalition for the work that you have done on the JCPOA, on the Iran nuclear deal, on disarmament and non-proliferation. And I hope that that same energy will be used in the future, as hopefully there will be some form of an effort of putting the JCPOA or some variation of it back into place in order to prevent what clearly would be a disastrous war in the Middle East. So for that, thank you all so much. Thank you for having me here again. I'm going to start off by asking what I think may be a bit of an uncomfortable, indeed an unpopular question, but one that I believe truly must be posed, which is, why does America no longer mediate peace? Why and how did we transition from being a country that was in many ways the capital of peacemaking to one that is now the Mecca of arms deals? Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to claim that the United States at any time of its history was Switzerland. It was not. But there was a period, a good period, in which there could not have been a peace deal worth the paper it was written on unless the United States endorsed it. America was the indispensable nation for peacemaking, and we cherished being seen as an honest broker, even when we weren't. But we valued the idea that we should be. But not anymore. Today, America increasingly prides itself on not being impartial. We strive to take sides in order to be on the right side of history, since we view statecraft not as a cosmic battle between good and evil, rather than a pragmatic exercise of conflict management where peace oftentimes comes at the expense of some justice. We abhor neutrality. To Washington's ears, neutrality means indifference. On every issue, there's two sides, the right side and the wrong, and thankfully, that is how simple the world is in Washington. Today, countries in the global south, China and many others, are often waving the flag of peacemaking and diplomacy, while the United States appears to increasingly favor military solutions to every problem. How did we land here? There are many factors, of course, and I don't want to present a simplistic analysis here, but I think there is one that is perhaps very important because it's the least misunderstood. And it goes to our broader approach to the world and two fundamental myths that are at the foundation of this outlook for our foreign policy. The first myth is that we believe that for America to be safe and for the world to be safe, America must dominate every important region of the world militarily. The second myth is that if we don't do this, if we don't have American hegemony, the world descends into chaos. The only thing that stands between order and utter global chaos is America's military might. We have, as a result, then, defined our interests throughout the world accordingly. I want to give you the example of the Middle East, where our failure in this approach is probably the most undeniable. We have defined our interest in the Middle East as follows, all under the rubric of global or regional stability. First, to protect the oil, to defeat terrorism, to spread democracy, to prevent vacuums, because if we don't do this, then the Russians or the Chinese are going to step into the vacuum that we will create. And perhaps the most problematic of them all, the catch-all variable for our interests, which is to stand by our allies. All of these, on surface, sound pretty good. But by saying, for instance, we have to stand by our allies, it essentially means that whatever their interests are, suddenly also are our interests. This then becomes an extremely expansive list of our interests are, and there's hardly anything in the region that doesn't qualify as a vital American interest, which then justifies the use of military force in order to protect it. So, has this made America more safe, or the region more safe? Let's take a look at this first myth. With such an expansive definition of our interest, as it justifies all of these different interventions, we have ended up with endless wars. We cannot expect not to have endless wars if we pursue this approach. If we believe that we have to dominate every important region in the world militarily all the time, we will be at war somewhere all the time. These endless wars that we've had have not come out of nowhere. It's a direct consequence of the approach that we've had. At the same time, because we've made our interests the interests of our allies, it's minimized our maneuverability. We currently don't have the ability to talk to most of the important powers in the region. We cannot maneuver diplomatically because we've gotten ourselves embroiled not only in our own conflicts, but in the conflicts of other states in the region. Can anyone here explain what is the vital American interest that justifies the United States supporting Saudi Arabia in its war in Yemen? What was it that actually mattered to the United States that justified the use of military force, providing all of these different weapons? It's part of the parcel of thinking that the interests of our so-called partners are also our interest. Suddenly expands exponentially, and we're at war everywhere. It has destabilized the Middle East, and I'll give you some statistics on that. And perhaps most importantly, it has led to a situation in which alternative paths to peace and stability, meaning paths that are not the ones that we've put forward, we are now starting to view as threats and problems. All of this, in my view, have made America less safe, and it certainly has made the region less safe. Just take a look at the track record. In 1998, the region suffered from 5 military conflicts. By 2020, that number was 22. That all happened under the watch of American hegemony. I'm not saying that the United States is at fault for all of these, but it happened under the watch of American hegemony, and incidentally, many of them are a direct consequence of the US invasion of Iraq and the destabilization that followed. Moreover, take a look at the cost to the United States and to the region. According to the Cost of War project at Brown University, up until 2018, the global war on terror cost the United States $6.4 trillion. And what did it do to the region? Again, the Cost of War project just came out with a really damning report a couple of weeks ago. 4.5 to 4.6 million people in the Middle East have been killed as a direct result of the global war on terror. That's more than 10 times the number of people the terrorists have killed during that same period. So it's devastated the region, and it's also cost the US a lot and made the United States less safe in the process. Now, let's take the second myth then. What about the counter-argument to say, well, however bad this has been, it would have been even worse if the United States didn't have its military domination in the region? Well, let's assess that myth. Over the course of the last 10 years or so, the United States has begun shifting its focus away from the Middle East, as well as some of its commitments. While regional states who favored permanent American domination, and they did so because we essentially protected those governments and regimes. So if you're sitting in Abu Dhabi or in Riyadh, you wanted American hegemony because it protected your regimes, protected your countries, and incidentally, it put America's military might on the scale of regional balance to your favor in a way that your own power could not. So they all benefited from it, and as a result, they worked they worked aggressively to make sure that it was maintained. Incidentally, part of the reason why Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel were the only three states that opposed the JCPOA was because they recognized if the JCPOA had been in place, the United States could slowly but surely start shifting its military out of the region, as the American public clearly wants. And that was one of the key reasons as to why they did not want to see the JCPOA, because they want to keep the United States in the region militarily. Now, but as the US has started to shift, I'm not saying in any way that this shift has been significant. We still have about 50,000 troops and 19 bases in the Middle East. But it is less than what it was before. As it has done so, there's been a process in which the regional states at first were denying that this was really happening, but now have come to the conclusion, particularly because of two specific events, that the United States, even if it keeps some troop levels in the region, no longer has the will to fight for or in the region. In September 2019, there was an attack on the Saudi oil fields of Abqaiq, which is largely believed to have been done by the Iranians in response to the Trump administration's effort to make sure that the Iranians could sell no oil. The Saudis expected that based on the Carter Doctrine, the United States would go to war with Iran because of that attack on Saudi oil fields. Trump did not. He even essentially hinted publicly that this was an attack on Saudi Arabia, not an attack on the United States. Then secondly, in January 2022, as a result of the Emiratis attacking and still occupying islands of Yemen, the Houthis attacked Abu Dhabi outside of the airport there. And the Emiratis expected that as a result, the United States immediately would come to the aid of the Emiratis militarily. Instead, the Biden administration, President Biden, did not respond, did not allow the use of American patriots, and did not take MBZ, who is the Mohammed bin Zayed, the de facto ruler of the Emirates, didn't take his call, which then left a lot of the regional states with the realization, okay, this was not just a Trump thing. The United States, because of pressure from the American public, they don't want to see more wars in the region, they want to bring troops home, and as a result, it is not reacting the way that they expected or the way that the United States would have done before. Now, according to this myth, and according to conventional Washington thinking, because of the fact that Trump did not go to war, because of the fact that Biden did not go to war, this would then have led to chaos in the region. But that is actually the opposite of what we saw. Instead of chaos, we suddenly saw the flourishing of intra-regional diplomacy. The Saudis started talking to the Iranians started talking to the Emiratis, the Turks and the Egyptians are making up, the Emiratis and the Qataris, the Saudis and the Qataris, like this flourishing of regional diplomacy that was not taking place before. And Washington has brilliantly avoided addressing why this is. And has managed to do so because very few in the media even raise deeper question as to why is it that we're suddenly seeing all of this diplomacy taking place. In fact, you also saw during this period the Iraqi government taking a very unusual and I would say promising initiative that has not come to its full conclusion. It's the Baghdad Dialogue. The Iraqis started hosting secret talks between so many different warring parties in the Middle East. And then later on turned that into what was called the Baghdad Dialogue. About 2 years or so ago, they had the first really open session, and you had the foreign ministers of almost all of these states, as well as many heads of states, on the same stage together, something that was impossible to envision just a couple of years ago. All of this actually happened because these countries realized the US is about to leave. And here's why. When you could hide behind American military power, your optimal solution was to do exactly that, which meant, why would you engage in costly, at times embarrassing diplomacy that would require you to make concessions if you could just hide behind the United States and have the US military take care of these problems for you, even if it didn't lead to a solution, but nevertheless you avoided having to make any compromises. Once that option didn't exist, these countries realized, oh my God, this risk of war is really dangerous. We're going to be in a really bad situation. We have to resolve our problems. What do? We engage in diplomacy. And thankfully, thanks to the Iraqis, the Omanis, Qataris, and some of these countries who had some experience in mediation and behind-the-scenes track 2 conversations, we saw this flourishing of diplomacy. And we've seen significant changes in the region ever since. The conflict between Qatar and Saudi Arabia is entirely over at this point. The Emiratis have normalized with Iran. The Saudis have normalized with Iran. The Iranians are likely going to normalize with Egypt and Jordan pretty soon as well. The Turks have made up with the Egyptians. Of course, the Syrians are back, the Assad regime, which of course raises some uncomfortableness as well, mindful of what the Syrian regime has done. But bottom line is the region is thinking, we have to end this war some way, somehow. It might not be the result many people had wished for, but if we don't resolve it, this civil war is going to continue. Syria has turned into essentially a criminal state that is living off of drugs and drug smuggling. This is going to be bad for the region as a whole. We need to resolve these things. So we've seen this flourishing of diplomacy, completely the opposite of what Washington's conventional wisdom had predicted. So when we stepped back militarily, the region actually stepped forward diplomatically. And ultimately, this is good for the United States. If it leads to a more stable region, that's good for the US. If it also means that the cost of maintaining that stability, resolving these conflicts, are taken care by the region itself as they're starting to take more responsibility for their own security, then ultimately that is also good for the US because it reduces the cost on American taxpayers. So if we then discard these two myths and define our interests in the region accordingly, we would end up solely focusing on A, making sure that there's no threat from the region that actually is a direct threat to the American heartland. We would be inclined to prevent any power in the region or outside to establish its own hegemony in the region because of the resources in the region. And we would continue to try to make sure that there's a free flow of commerce. None of these interests, however, justify a military presence in the Middle East. Not a single military base is needed in order to protect those interests as defined. And this would then enable the United States to disentangle itself from many of the conflicts in the region, which then increases America's diplomatic maneuverability and can pave the way for the US to once again play the role of a mediator rather than to become a co-belligerent in all of the region's conflicts. Ultimately, better for the US, also better for the United States, for the region. So in such a multipolar world, shared responsibility for security can be a virtue that reduces the burden on Americans without increasing threats to US interests. It's not security that we would give up in such a world, but the illusion that we have to control events far, far away, because if we don't, it will lead to chaos. Now, some will object, and they say, well, hold on, if we do this, we're going to create these vacuums, the Chinese are going to come in, the Russians are going to come in, and they're going to establish their influence. These military vacuums are essentially begging for China to come into the region and replace the United States. But is that what we are seeing, however? Because if we take a look at what's happened in the last couple of months, we've seen that the Chinese have stepped in, they have mediated between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and there's more mediation and other security collaborations that seems to be on the table. The Chinese succeeded in doing this, bringing the Saudis and the Iranians together precisely because China was on neither's side. They were not taking the side of the Saudis, they were not taking the side of the Iranians. They were neutral, what we used to be. With stubborn discipline, Beijing maintained a neutral position on the two country squabbles and didn't moralize about who's right or who's wrong, and certainly did not bother to think whose side history is on. They treated this as a conflict between humans that needed a solution rather than a sermon. Sorry to say that in this building, it might be a bit out of place. Nor did the Chinese bribe Iran or Saudi Arabia with security guarantees, arms deals, or military bases, which is all too often the way we do things. So contrary to Washington's fears, China did not use this mediation to establish a military presence in the Middle East to replace the United States. It did not fill the military vacuum. It filled the diplomatic vacuum we had created by a militarized foreign policy. Sadly, I have to say, we seem to be doubling down on this approach at this moment. The guiding star of our foreign policy increasingly seems to be that we are in some sort of an inevitable security and great power competition with China. In my view, that has further corrupted our approach to diplomacy and mediation. To the extent that we engage in mediation today, we do so largely to help our side in a conflict advance our position, rather than to establish a lasting peace. We do it to demonstrate the value of allying with the United States against China or other competitors. And the reason for that is because the Pentagon defines this competition with China as not a competition of countries, but a competition of coalitions. For that reason, consequently, we keep our coalition partners close by offering them, in addition to our military might, our services as a partial broker to tilt the scales of diplomacy in their favor. It's all us versus them rather than seeking a solution. This threatens now to make us not just a country that has moved beyond peacemaking, but one that is also increasingly averse to the peacemaking of others. I would argue that the greatest threat we face as a nation, for our security and for our reputation, is if we stand in the way of a world where others are allowed to have a stake in peace. If we become a nation that doesn't just put diplomacy last, but also dismisses those who seek to put diplomacy first. If our quest for domination puts us on the opposite side of the geopolitical gravitational forces that are inching the world toward multipolarity. If we continue on this current path, and by that become the power that countries look to for weapons and war, while they look to China or others when they want to seek peace, stability, and development. In my view, we should be wise not to fight the wrong battles here. Because in tomorrow's world, we should not worry if some roads to peace go through Beijing, New Delhi, or Brasilia, as long as all paths to war do not go through Washington. Thank you so much.
stay up here for questions.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll handle the questions.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you.
And I forgot to say the title of Dr. Parsi's talk was Can America Be a Peacemaker Again? And I think he gave us a roadmap, didn't he, to how that could happen. Hallelujah. So we're going to have a question-answer period now, and I think we'll be able to handle quite a few because Dr. Parsi was actually pretty brief. So what I'm going to do is ask people here in the room, in person, to raise your hand if you have a question to ask, and I'm going to number you off. And then when we're done with those questions, we'll get to people on Zoom. So 1, 2, Steve, I see your hand. You definitely. Number 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Anyone else that I didn't point to? 8. 8 questions here in the room. Let's take those in order. And where's Sophia? Could somebody bring the, there you are. So questioner number 1, wait for the mic to come before you speak your question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Parsi. My name is David Abraham. I agree entirely with the prescriptive notion that the United States should yield some peacemaking authority to others and back off. But I'm struck that both in your comments and in Congresswoman Watson Coleman's, there seemed to be a kind of before and after. Phrases like once again emerged both in your talk and hers. And I'm wondering when this golden age actually existed. I mean, for her, and Congresswoman Watson Coleman is one of the 24 best advocates we have in the Congress for all the causes we believe in, so no slight intended. But for her, there seemed to be a before and an after. Trump did all those bad things, and Biden is doing better things. But when we were an unchallenged power, you used the phrase indispensable nation, which of course was Madeleine Albright's excuse or cover for wars everywhere, NATO expansion and the like. And it's good to see a byproduct of America's turn to China being the kind of Middle East regional diplomacy that you underscored. At the same time, we're seeing that turn to China has led to the Biden administration's fueling the Russian-Ukrainian war, has led to ominous threats in the Pacific. So I'm not sure that there is a before and an after here. When we were unchallenged, we were aggressive. Now that we are challenged, we're responding aggressively. So I wonder wherein you might see not just byproducts that are more diplomacy-oriented, but a consistent strategy and worldview that's less imperial and more accepting of multipolarity.
Thank you so much. That's a great question, which is precisely why I put in that line, I never claimed that we were ever Switzerland, to make sure. But you raise a very important point, and I agree with your observation. Making an exact before or after is going to be extremely difficult. I would certainly not put it at Trump. I think that, well, let me give you this statistic. One of our non-resident fellows, Monica Tuft, up in Massachusetts, she came out with a report about 6-7 months ago now, I think, perhaps a little bit longer. They looked at all of America's military interventions since 1776, all of them. And guess what? 25% of them came after the end of the Cold War. Once the United States was an undisputed military power at its apex of security, it became a far more interventionist power. And that's one of the problems with unipolarity. Instead of actually shouldering the responsibility that came with that and creating more stable peace, unfortunately, we became more interventionist. Having said that, I think it's still a reality that we have to recognize that there was a period in the 1990s. That doesn't mean that the United States didn't engage in unnecessary wars or did everything perfectly. But I find it fascinating that back then, there was a desire to be seen as an honest broker. There was, I remember when Madeleine Albright had to defend the use of a veto in the Security Council on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, or the threat of the veto, and essentially said, well, we have to do this in order to remain an honest broker. Now, I don't necessarily think we were truly one, but there was a recognition that we should be perceived as one. Now we're in the opposite space. Now we're just concerned about whether we're on the right side of history in a very simplistic analysis. And we, as I said, abhor being seen as neutral or not taking sides. So I recognize what you're saying. There's been a definite problem of what you called imperialism throughout this period. I think we're just in a much worse situation now in this regard. And I think it's precisely for what you said. Now we feel that we're challenged. And we think that we have to reverse this trend. We think that we have to dominate China. Because if China doesn't dominate us, if we don't, then China is going to dominate us. It's a very simplistic either or. There's no space for any idea that there could be coexistence. I'm of the view that we absolutely have no chance of being able to dominate a giant like China, a country of 1.2 billion people, in the long run. Nor do I think the Chinese have the ability to dominate the United States. The answer lies in finding new rules of how coexistence can happen in a system that is either bipolar / multipolar, because it's going to be different from what it was before. Before, there were 2 top states, and everyone else, there was a big gap before you saw the other states. Now there may be 2 top states, but the gap is going to be very small, and you're going to have a whole set of very powerful states, India in this century, for instance. That's a very complex system. And the absolute worst thing we can have is to have such simplistic ideas of thinking the only way we can be safe is if we dominate. It doesn't matter who we have to dominate or how big that challenge is. That, in my view, is the biggest danger. That's going to be the main driver force of instability if we try to reverse this trend of multipolarity. And in that sense, I do believe we're in a worse situation now than we were 20 years ago.
Sophia, I think it was my daughter was the next question, and then Steve was third.
Excuse me. Thank you, Dr. Parsi. That was a really exciting talk. I feel like I've learned a lot. I have a lot to think about. I had a question. I feel that one of the big roles of the United Nations is, in theory, to be kind of a vessel for greater diplomacy, greater multipolarity in the world. What are some things that it could be doing differently, ways that it could change, and ways that the U.S. could help it affect this change?
It's an excellent question. If you take a look at how the world was governed or how these institutions functioned 30 years ago, if there was a major war breaking out, the first thing that would happen is that the UN Secretary General would jump on a plane and begin some form of mediation and begin some effort to de-escalate. Today, no one even asks what Guterres is doing on this issue. And this is a direct result of more than 2 decades of efforts, and I have to say, from our end, starting with the Bush administration, of weakening the UN because we were increasingly seeing the United Nations as a constraint on American power. The Bush administration was very explicit about this. There was the debate as to whether Colin Powell should even go to the UN Security Council to make that fake claim of Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. The argument inside the Bush administration at the time was, why even give the legitimacy of the UN to think that we need their permission? The United States should just do what it can do because we're that powerful. That's what unipolarity is all about. And we have systematically done this, even under this administration, not as blatantly in any way, shape, or form. But the message that the Biden administration sent to UN officials about 2 years ago, this is before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, was that when we talk about a rules-based order, we're not talking about a UN-centric rules-based order, which raises the question, what is it centered on? If it's not centered on the UN system and international law, then the only alternative I can see is that it's centered on American military power. So we're seeing the same trends, different administrations, different rhetoric, not as blatant, but the structure of the policy has not shifted dramatically.
Thank you. And Steve, you're next.
Thank
This
you.
is the first event I go to in which the technical guy has a question. That's awesome. Thank you.
It's very interesting to hear and very encouraging to hear the things that you talk about with regard to peace efforts in the Middle East. And I'm just wondering, it seems to me that much of this is we've been kept in the dark over in this country, through the media and everything. Do you have recommendations for us in terms of media where we can learn things like this and see what is happening in places like the Middle East more clearly than we do?
Thank you. I think the only thing that is more difficult to fix than the state of the world is the state of our media. So I can't claim that I have great recommendations for you. I find it to be a tremendous problem, without a doubt. And I find it fascinating, but at the same time, discouraging and worrisome. When I speak to college campuses, etc., it's just really fascinating to see what younger people are watching. They're not watching CNN, MSNBC, Fox, or any of these news channels. They're watching news channels that are popping up on YouTube. They're getting, some of them have viewership that is much larger than some of the networks actually do. And many of them are a reaction to the mainstream media. I'm not saying that necessarily all of them are doing a better job, but the need for something better has generated an entire plethora of other avenues, not regulated, not necessarily with the same standards, but some of them, frankly, are doing a better job. And I've been fascinated because many of those young people, they did not know me from any of the mainstream media. They had watched me on Breaking Points or on Hill TV Rising, etc., because that's where they get their news from. We have a major problem when everyone shapes their own reality based on a whole set of different news, and there's no effort to have some sort of a common dialogue and understanding of these things. At the same time, if the mainstream is going to continue to use a language that perpetuates American hegemony, then we certainly do need an alternative. Listen to how they ask questions next time you see a press conference with a president or with a key member of Congress. The underlying premises of their questions are oftentimes these two myths that I just presented to you. It's oftentimes, what is the United States doing militarily about this or that? And oftentimes are pushing politicians to have to look tough because those are the questions they're getting from the media. It's a tremendous problem. I wish I had a much better answer for you. But one small thing, you can go to quincy.org, that's our website. That's where you will get a lot of analysis that explicitly is questioning the foundations, the first premises of the way we have pursued our foreign policy for the last decades.
Can you repeat the website?
Yes, Quincy, and then INST for institution.org.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think fourth question was up here.
Hi, thank you so much for that excellent talk. I have a question about the interventional America, and the more recent ones were regarding Syria and, of course, Afghanistan. In Syria, no sooner did Trump withdraw from Syria that Russia went in. I read where they even had cold Coke in the refrigerators. Everything was left behind. So Syria might be a separate domain relative to the other countries in the Middle East. I'm not sure. But there's that question about when America does withdraw, what comes in, and what does America do about that, especially from my background with Russia. Russia wants to integrate, infiltrate, and destroy Western democracy. That's what I've always learned, and that's what I see. In addition, similarly with Afghanistan, Trump withdrew first phase. Biden was pressed based on the agreement with the Taliban to withdraw as well. The Taliban have taken over. What kind of negotiation is occurring? My understanding is they're way back to where the quote-unquote terrorism of the Taliban existed. That's part one. Part two is, how does AI affect all of this?
Wow. Okay, let me start off with Syria. The Russians were in Syria long before Trump. And Trump didn't really withdraw. He withdrew from like one base. He talked a big game about withdrawing. He didn't really. And in fact, listen carefully to what he said. He gave it at a press conference. He was pushing for a withdrawal, and many of his generals and others did not favor that. And at a press conference, he said, I don't know if we'll stay, perhaps we don't. I know there's a lot of countries that want us to stay. Well, if they want us to stay, they should pay. And he was referencing the Saudis, and the Saudis did end up paying for a lot of the US staying. So Trump was not the type of a president that's like, from a perspective of stability or US interests, felt like, we should not put US servicemen and women unnecessarily at risk. He was approaching this as if this is a for-profit. And if there's a way for someone else to pay for our military to be there, then that's great. So he was never in that camp. Now, he withdrew from one base, and the Russians took a couple of Diet Cokes, I'll admit that. But the issue is, we never had a congressional authority to be in Syria in the first place. We're not in Syria right now because of stability. We're not there because we gave up long ago the idea that Assad was going to fall. We're there for other reasons. Part of those reasons is that we fear that if we leave, the Iranians are going to be able to infiltrate Syria, and that's going to be a threat to Israel. In the case of Afghanistan, Trump started the negotiations. They made a deal with the Taliban, the Doha Agreement. I would actually give him credit for that. And then Biden came in, was really undecided until the last moment what he wanted to do. 3 weeks before he made a speech saying that we're going to withdraw, US military officials were still instructed to tell all allied countries, don't worry, we're never going to withdraw. So they were very upset as well. No one could plan, and that was because of the debate inside the administration. I think he made the right decision in withdrawing, because at the end of the day, it was not a scenario in which if he had stayed, we would have had the same status quo, meaning 2,500 troops, and the Kabul government was essentially in charge of big parts of the country. The agreement was very clear. If the United States did not withdraw, then the Taliban would be attacking. And then we would not see 2,500 troops, there would be another surge. And 10,000 plus American troops would have to go back into Afghanistan. We also know, thanks to the Pentagon Papers published by the Washington Post, that from earlier than 2010, we knew not only that we were not winning, and that we would not win, and that we could not even define victory any longer. But the government kept on telling the people, just another 6 months, we're about to turn a corner, and we did not. And if we couldn't stand up a government that could stand on its own legs after 20 years, how many more decades do we need? And it's not as if that money went to the Afghan people, by the way. 97% of the money that was allocated for Afghanistan came back to defense contractors in Northern Virginia, where I live. I noticed all of the swimming pools that suddenly started to pop up throughout Northern Virginia as a result of all of that money coming back. So my conclusion is, when the best time is to withdraw? Is to not go in the first place. There is no good time to withdraw. Once you're in, it is such a mess. And that's why I think, as much as I do think that there's justification for critique of how the Biden administration handled the withdrawal, we should not have an unrealistic expectation that there could be a 20-year failed occupation followed by a brilliantly executed withdrawal. It was no different from the occupation itself.
Okay, thank you. Who was number 5? Okay, Carol, hey, right here.
And on AI, I have no clue.
I'll keep you off that. Interesting how this sequence worked out, because I wanted to ask you an economic question. I know stories in the various times and places where the military has been used to do helpful humanitarian tasks, that they're very well organized and they're doing that rather than fighting a war. And so I'm wondering if there are any ideas how our whole defense military industrial establishment could be guided into any constructive ways. I don't know how much that economic power is pushing the political direction.
Thank you. I think that's a really important question. I'm going to push back a little bit, though. I'll tell you why. There's a reason why the military is well organized to do some of these things. It's because they get $800 billion. Whereas other agencies that should be doing this stuff is not getting any money. We have a process in which the military is taking over more and more and more tasks because they're getting all the money. From giving COVID vaccines to some of the examples that you get. And incidentally, a lot of diplomatic tasks that are now falling under the Pentagon instead of the State Department. That is the true militarization of our foreign policy. And the argument then ends up becoming, well, they're well organized, they know how to do this stuff now. Well, because we give them all the money. Right. If we actually divided the money, allocated it more where it's supposed to be, diplomats are supposed to do diplomacy. They're trained to do diplomacy. Give them the funding to be able to do diplomacy. We have USAID that should be doing some of these other things. If they would then subcontract certain aspects of it for logistical reasons to the military, that's a different story. That's something that perhaps could happen. But now we just have this behemoth and we want to use it for everything, including things that it is not designed to do and probably would not do as well as the actual agencies if those agencies were funded.
Okay, number 6. Oh, go to you have.
Again, thank you for a great talk and something I've been really worried about because even though I think that Biden has been a much better president than Trump domestically, overseas, I don't think it's been as good. Still better than Trump, but we can do a lot better. In terms of Ukraine, which is, I know, an incredibly complex situation, but I wondered about your thoughts about the Ukraine because I do think Russia is the aggressor here. On the other hand, the expansion of NATO, et cetera, and I think there were missed opportunities for negotiation beforehand. The other just thing I'll say, which I know you probably can't even come close to talking about, is that I am worried about authoritarianism around the world, in Russia, in China, in India, and in the United States, among other countries. So unfortunately, I see that rising in all these countries, including here off and on, and other more straight up, and I'm just interested if you have any thoughts on that. Thank you.
Sure. First question on Ukraine, I fully agree with you. I don't think there's much of a debate, to be frank, that Russia is the aggressor. Russia invaded that country last February. It was an act of aggression. In many ways, perhaps not terribly different from the US's invasion of Iraq. Both of those acts should be condemned, are illegal, are contrary to international law. Both of them have analysis of what happened before, things that perhaps could have been done to prevent them, things that help us understand why such a decision was made. It's not to take agency away from Putin in the sense that he ultimately made that decision to invade. He was not forced to. But I think it would be historically dishonest to suddenly now say, which I know you didn't, by the way, but some in Washington are saying that, NATO expansion had nothing to do with it. Bill Burns wrote clearly in his book, it was published before this invasion took place, when he served in Russia many times, both as a junior or a mid-level diplomat and later on as the ambassador, that NATO expansion towards Ukraine was the brightest of red lines for Russians, not just for Putin. And to think that that did not contribute to this scenario, I think would be unfair and incorrect. It's sometimes things that are analysis or a narrative that is put forward to completely absolve ourselves from any potential role or responsibility in all of this. Again, I'm not saying it's the US's fault. I do think the Biden administration committed a huge mistake prior to the invasion, however. There were direct talks between Putin and Biden. And according to the Biden administration themselves, we never put NATO expansion on the table. In fact, Biden made a clear statement saying that the door is open for Ukraine to join, which I think is unfortunate because Ukraine was not going to join. There was no way that Ukraine would have been able to be let in because Ukraine was still in an active conflict because of what happened since 2014. So there was no realistic short-term path for Ukraine. But by saying that we refuse to touch this issue, we took away the opportunity to test whether we could perhaps have prevented this war. Let's say we put forward the idea, okay, at Quincy Institute we had put forward a memo arguing for a 10-year moratorium on NATO expansion. It won't happen for 10 years. Test it. If it turns out that we said to Putin, we're not going to, Ukraine has a right to join NATO, but that doesn't mean that NATO has a responsibility to take it in. It's a coalition. It needs to go through all kinds of different calculations. But let's say that we had said, for the next 10, 15 years, NATO expansion is not on the table. If he still had invaded, at least then we could have said, okay, you know what? NATO expansion was a factor before, but it doesn't seem to have been a factor this time around. We didn't exhaust that card at all. We actually went in a different direction. And I think that was a mistake. That doesn't mean that it's not Putin's fault that he decided to invade. We never took diplomacy as seriously as we should have, in my view. And the question, what are we doing now? I find it problematic that we have, while we, in my view, should support Ukraine, it's been a victim of aggression, but there seems to be an effort to create a narrative in which we exceptionalize Ukraine. Because this war is different from all wars in human history. And as a result, the blueprints for de-escalation, ceasefire, etc., simply does not apply to this case. I can tell you it's a narrative that is falling on completely deaf ears outside of the West and 2, 3 Asian countries. The global South is upset. They don't understand why we're not doing anything to get diplomacy started. No one is naive about how difficult it's going to be. I sat with South African diplomats a couple of weeks ago in Washington, and they said something I thought was a rather powerful statement. They said, we negotiated with the apartheid regime, a regime that did not even consider us full humans. But we engaged in diplomacy in order to end that conflict and gain our rights. So how can we then now say that diplomacy is off the table in the case of Ukraine and Russia? Of course it has to be tried. Of course there has to be a parallel effort. And again, I think if you're outside of the West and you're a little bit further away from Europe, in which perhaps they don't have the same sense of threat from Russia, well, that's the same approach we have to many conflicts. In Yemen, for instance, I heard the Congresswoman talk about her efforts to put an end to that war. I know the coalition has done a lot of good work at that, and I applaud you for it. There were voices who were saying, well, hold on, if we do a ceasefire in Yemen, it's going to benefit the Houthis because they made a lot of gains. And that was not technically wrong necessarily, but it was not a valid argument not to at least try and see what we can do to save human lives. And I have to say, I would not underestimate the number of people in this country who may not like Trump, who may strongly dislike him, But when he was on CNN and he was pressed, but don't you want Ukraine to win? And his answer was, I don't see this as part of winning or losing. I want the killing to stop. I wish a progressive candidate was saying that. Because a lot of people who do not like Trump are going to be attracted by that. They're going to be attracted because at least he's talking about ending this, rather than just constantly saying, well, the next counteroffensive, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, we all want Ukraine to be in a very good negotiating position. But just as it comes to what's the best timing for a withdrawal, it's really difficult to time exactly when you should start negotiations. Because you have no idea. I mean, last year, Ukraine may have been in a better, what if this counteroffensive goes really badly? Then Ukraine is going to be in a worse negotiating position than it was 3-4 months ago. And what are we going to do then? We're going to go on this war for another 2 years? Hundreds of thousands of people killed? Diplomacy should be there in parallel. Washington has treated it as if we talk, it means that the war automatically ends or there is an automatic ceasefire. That's not the case. In most of these wars, unfortunately, people are killing each other and they're talking at the same time. We're not even doing that. We don't have an active diplomacy going on. And active diplomacy does not automatically mean an immediate ceasefire that arguably would be favoring the Russians. Once the perfect time comes for diplomacy, with what confidence can we say we know that we're going to be able to kick it off really fast because we're the only ones who have a say in this? Or in terms of the proposals that are now being put forward by Indonesia yesterday, the African states are putting forward a proposal. The Chinese have floated their idea. We have to be careful of how ferociously we dismiss those. Because once the moment comes in which there is going to be some serious diplomacy, which almost always happens, all wars end in some form of diplomacy. We have to recognize that based on all of our sanction and everything we've done, we have very little leverage over Russia. We have leverage over Ukraine. Ukraine cannot continue this war for more than a week without our support. But we don't have any leverage over Russia. So how are we going to conduct that diplomacy without any leverage? Who has leverage? China. China has leverage. And we have to be a little bit more diplomatic in dealing with, okay, that day may come in which we're actually going to need the Chinese if we want to have a peace deal that can last, that also supports and safeguards Ukraine's territorial integrity. We may think that the Chinese are doing it too soon, fine. But there's been this attitude in which anyone who wants to do diplomacy is doing it for the sake of Putin. I think that's really, really problematic. And it's going to ultimately hurt the Ukrainians. And in fact, if you take a look at how the Ukrainians have reacted to some of these things, the Ukrainians did not dismiss the Chinese proposal. They know very well that if they do, not only do they potentially risk pushing China closer to Russia, which is against their interest, but if they want a deal at some point, they will need the leverage that China can put on Russia. So we're not doing them a favor by dismissing diplomacy at hand.
Who was this, number 7? Oh, who was that right here? Lou.
Thank you again. That was such an original perspective. I can't tell you how thought-provoking it is. And obviously, what could be more right than your statement of we cannot expect to dominate China. It's not 1800s anymore. This is the reality. But when you look at Taiwan and Hong Kong and the South China Sea, China's power and intentions are positively frightening. What should we do? How should this turn out? How do we get, what does an acceptable outcome look like of us not trying to contain China that doesn't end up with the whole world living like the Uyghurs?
It's a great question. I think the first start, we should not base our policies on the worst assumptions about Chinese policies, because that then ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we take all nuance away from what China does and just assume the absolute worst, then our response is going to have to be the worst that we can come up with in countering that. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and we all likely end up dying, because a war between the United States and China will be the bloodiest war in the history of humanity. When you take a look at the Chinese military structure, this is not my area of expertise, I'm lending it from people within Quincy who have studied these. They certainly don't have a military that has the capacity, or is even designed to invade Australia. In fact, it's not really going to be successful invading Taiwan either. It's very, very difficult for them. They have a military posture and structure and a budget that seems much more geared towards defending their extremely long landlines against two major powers who have a history of conflict with China, India and Russia. So we have to be careful not constantly assuming the worst. Now, that doesn't mean that the situation with Taiwan is not a very, very sensitive one. I met with officials from the Taiwanese government, who are now in power, not in power any longer. They're very worried, both about what China may do, but also because of the context and the atmosphere that has been created. People oftentimes forget that there was a significant tourism and travel between the mainland and Taiwan for many, many years. One of these people, who was a former defense minister, was telling me, I have a network in China. Every time I went there, I saw all of these different people. We have now a generation of Taiwanese that don't have any of that connectivity with the mainland. And they're very worried what that's going to lead to. Because any prospects of being able to resolve that conflict peacefully requires some of that people-to-people, face-to-face engagement. And the environment that has now been created, and there's many entities that deserve blame for it, has made it very difficult for that to continue. And that increases the likelihood of us going in the problematic direction. I think there are still ways that we can prevent such a war. That I don't buy into the idea necessarily that Xi has decided that by 2027, Taiwan has to be reintegrated, etc. But the more we on our end push and saying, take a look at Ukraine, that's what's going to happen to you, etc., etc., we're just unfortunately raising tensions in a way that doesn't seem to be constructive. I'm not saying the Chinese are not doing a lot of bad things as well. They certainly are. But here's the thing. In this century, the most important thing, the most important questions of all, is how these two great powers manage to find a way to coexist. If they don't, nothing else that we seek to achieve will be achievable, including, for the young people in the audience, the most important thing, which is climate change. We talk about climate change as an existential threat, and the Biden administration definitely says that and has been serious in many different ways on the domestic agenda. I'm not seeing our foreign policy adjusted in such a way that we truly are acting as if climate change is the existential threat, not the invasion of another country. Those common threats in this century are going to be the most important ones. And reality is that the military is not going to be able to be providing us with a solution against climate change. In fact, it's the biggest polluter in the United States. Nor against pandemics or other types of shared threats that are the most important ones that we're going to be faced with. For long periods of time in the last 2 years, we had more than 2 amounts of 9/11 deaths a day because of COVID. More Americans have died of COVID in the last 2 years, 3 years, than all Americans died in all the wars we've had since 1945. So let's be a little bit clear what the real threats are that we have to focus on for the next generation. It's not in any way, shape, or form helpful what the Chinese are doing, but we got to be careful not to lose perspective of what truly ends up being existential.
I apologize, but we've got to be out of this room in about 5 minutes because the choir is going to be rehearsing in here pretty soon for an evening service. So I apologize we won't get to the 8th question. I apologize we didn't get to anybody on Zoom. But thank you all very, very much for coming today. I agree with what Lou said. This was a truly outstanding and stimulating talk. Original thinking. Let's give Dr. Parsi a real hand. As you get ready to leave, one last thing about the envelopes. If you still, Carol has the basket of them. If you still don't even get a chance to turn it in before you leave this, that is a postage-paid envelope. You can still mail it to us, okay? And lastly, there was a fair amount of food we had for the sponsor reception that didn't get eaten up, so if you want to take a peek at it, it's still out there in the room where I'm pointing to. Feel free to take a batch home with you. We'd love for you to do that, okay? Cookies, fruit, veggies. Thanks again.